It's my great pleasure now to introduce to you the next talks, which are two key core perspectives on transformation. And we're really lucky to have with us today two of the pioneers in thinking about transformations. People that have really influenced my thinking a lot and have really inspired me to work in this area. So they're kind of, I consider both of them the path breakers. And I'm going to introduce both of them and sit down because we're short on time. Then I'll just have present Carl Folke, who will do his talk first on reconnecting to the biosphere. Carl is the science director at the Stockholm Resilience Center and the director of the Biosphere Institute of Ecological Economics at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. He's been working in the field of ecology and society and transdisciplinary collaborations for years, and he's really been an inspirational thinker in how we actually approach transformation. I think that what he's going to talk about today really gets to the essence of how we have to transform without forgetting that we're transforming in connection with the biosphere. After Carl gives this talk, we're going to invite Frans Berkhout, who is a professor of innovation and sustainability and the director of the Amsterdam Global Change Institute at the Free University of Amsterdam, to talk about transformation. And his title of his talk is Speed, Scope, and Depth: What Counts in a Socio-Technical Transformation. Frans was an earlier leader of an international human dimensions project on industrial transformations, and he really works at the nuts and the bolts and the practical and the social structures, the cultural landscapes, how we actually do transformation in praxis. So between these two talks, I think we'll have a lot of food for thought, and if we have any time to have any, I can pose questions to Carl, Frans, or Cecilia about this. But in the meantime, Carl, please welcome, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Karin, for inviting me. It's really nice to be in a conference that is a little bit not so much of a conference, hopefully. And I hope I won't bore you too much with a conventional talk, but hopefully give you some inspiration for the next coming days. This is a theme that I think is very important for all of us here to really think about what direction of transformations we're talking about. If you really think about it, we're in an enormous universe. It's just unbelievably big. We can't imagine how big it is actually, and all these galaxies out there, and we're in the Milky Way. I think it has over 500 billion stars, and one of these stars is the sun, of course, and we have a couple of planets around the sun, and we happen to be on one, and so far the only one that has life on it actually. And I think that's something to really think about actually, that we are the only one that we know has life, at least this type of life. And we have the opportunity to walk around on this planet for 6, 7, 8, perhaps 10 decades and enjoy being alive. I think that's quite amazing. Something we tend to forget about when we fight and quarrel and do lots of crazy things, but just that fact, to be alive, is quite unusual. And we think about, we're part of the biosphere, this little thin layer of planet Earth, a very thin layer actually, where life has evolved and we with it. Take that step back and think about what you do in your daily life and the fights you have in your universities or in your companies. Just to have that enormous opportunity to be part of the biosphere. And obviously we're quite embedded. We are part of and embedded in the biosphere. It's not an externality out there somewhere. The environment is not something outside us that we need to bring into the economy or get into how we measure economic progress. It's really, we're part of it. We're totally embedded in it. Just physically, without water, our bodies would dry out quite fast. So that's my overall message, actually, to really think about that we're part of the planet, and I think we really need to reconnect to it, actually. in a much deeper way than we have done so far. And then, of course, we're in the new phase of the Anthropocene that all of you are more or less familiar with. I won't dwell so much on it, but the whole an incredible increase in speed, scale, and connectivity that has happened, especially since the Second World War. It's just unbelievable how we now have become a global force of shaping the way the whole round ball operates, actually. It's actually an incredible achievement that we can do that as a species, that we have been able to become a global force. What's embarrassing, though, is that we often don't recognize it, but that's one of the transformational challenges. 3 different interpretations of the Anthropocene. This is the French one. We're basically eating up the planet. We have a US one, which is building sort of a more technical construction one. And then there was also one in The Economist about the welcome to the Anthropocene. And I thought that one of the statements there was pretty interesting also for this conference. Humans have changed the way the world works. Now they have to change the way they think about it too. So I think that's really a critical comment from that magazine. And what is really then going on, you could ask, what is really going on? And here are a few trends that I think we're in right now, in addition to being in the Anthropocene. First of all, we're in a situation of completely new interactions, actually, that we haven't really seen before, between the economy, society, and the planet, playing out in new, surprising ways, often in, as Karin said, in many new non-linear ways. We're starting to see a lot of that. We're in a new revolution, which makes the future quite unpredictable. And a revolution that has enormous opportunities, but also a lot of challenges, of course. And the last is the great acceleration, a new great acceleration of a lot of people on Earth moving from poverty into more of a middle-class situation. So that's right now. It's going on right now, and that's something we have to relate to more explicitly. Another thing that I think is profoundly, to me at least, was really important one is the recognition that the phase we're in right now is more of a climate exception than the rule for planet Earth. So if you look at the last 100,000 years, it was moving around quite a lot on the planet in terms of temperature, and these are from ice cores on Greenland. We came out of Africa, we started to move around on the planet. We couldn't settle down because it was too much of a variation, basically. Then, some 10,000 years ago, we went into the Holocene era. And it took a little less than 2,000 years, and we started agriculture. And then all our civilizations and everything has come after that. Something we take for granted. This era is the way it will be, and we will, perhaps with climate, shift it around a little bit. But actually, it could be pretty dramatic. That's why we did this graph that Karin showed, the whole idea of planetary boundaries. It's not about limits, it's about zones that we should avoid moving into to avoid shifting out of a Holocene-like state, basically. So the idea was to talk a little bit about the safe operating space for humanity in that framework of a Holocene envelope. Okay, so what are we doing then? Well, if you think about it, I think in 2-3 generations, especially in the Western world, we have created mindsets as if we're independent of the planet we're living on. We're still dividing this up in social and natural sciences. We talk about fights between, there's not enough natural sciences here, there's not enough social sciences, humanities, all this. I think, in my view, it's embarrassing, actually, that we are still dividing up the way we generate knowledge into these type of pathways. If I should be embarrassed for being a human, I think it is that we have created these mindsets in 2.5 generations of believing that we're independent of the planet, and that we fix it within society, and that we fix it with new technologies, as if the biosphere is not something that really matters. That's truly embarrassing, I think, actually. And it may lead to these type of transitions, of course, like going out of the Holocene level at the global scale, but also these nonlinear interactions of tipping points and thresholds. And I won't go through that. I know many of you are familiar with that. The ultimate challenge then, I think, is to really, how can we persist in a Holocene-like state? Because we're a little bit over 7 billion today. And if we move out of that state, it may be it's not certain that our best behaviors will remain on the planet. I think we have been tremendously successful in creating a world in relative peace where 7 billion not fighting all the time, which we did in the old days, and we have democracy and at least some idea of human rights and things like that. It would be sad to throw that away, but the point is that to be able to stay in a Holocene-like state at the global level, we need transformations at more local and regional scales that ultimately lead to a global transformation. And that's the way we try to think about these things, is something we call resilience thinking. So that's a lens. You can use other lenses, but that's the one we often use. And many people think of resilience as only persistence, actually, which is just one part of the picture for us. So persistence is how you live with change and continue on the pathway you are. And the way we look at adaptability is being on that pathway, developing with that pathway and adapting to it, to change on that pathway. But transformability is basically shifting away to another pathway, often it could be a major radical shift. So these are three facets of resilience thinking that we work with, and transformability is really moving away on the path we're in. And I would say something as blunt as all the technological change we've seen that we think often is revolutionary is just reinforcing the current pathway of business as usual, as you mentioned. We haven't seen any technological change yet shifting pathways really for the broader human enterprise. Some other facets that we operate with is really this interplay between rapid and change and incremental change. How for example, extreme events or political shocks interact with more slower processes. How multiple scales interact, how different experiences, memories, and knowledges can be recombined for innovation, and how we can frame creativity, and especially this transformation towards reconnecting to the biosphere, and that's what we're working a lot on. So when we look at transformations, we sort of frame them in the context of reconnecting to the planet. So we're doing it practically on landscapes and seascapes, and when we work on landscapes and seascapes, we have studied several places that have shifted from uncoordinated resource management or no resource management at all, basically, into stewardship of the broader landscapes and seascapes, more of an ecosystem-like approach, or we call it a social-ecological systems approach. And here are some features that often comes back in those cases, that often there is a perceived crisis. It may be real or not, but it is a perceived crisis that leads to a shift in mindsets, normally among a few individuals. And they create a shared vision of a transformation or a new direction, basically. And they start to integrate perspectives. There will be windows of opportunities to shift the whole system into a new direction. There is an enormous interaction between different individuals, the agency, basically, and the organizational structures, institutions, and networks. A lot of experimentation going on. And these are features of social ecological transformations that are coming back and back in all the cases that we are looking into. And just to give you three ones, the first one is from Chile, where basically the political crisis after the Pinochet era made it possible to redirect the whole stewardship of the coastal zone there. The Great Barrier Reef also went through this type of crisis, from believing that the reefs were completely safe to climate change awareness and the need to strengthen resilience of the reef. And the last one I just mentioned also. But we see this sort of, it's a little graph illustrating how you can prepare for system change. And I think this conference is a sort of a part of that preparation. Karen said that it only takes about 10%, was it 10 or 20? 10% in networks to tip whole networks around. So there's a lot of things going on the planet now preparing for system change, I think. And then when the windows open up to navigate through those changes and shift direction. These are pathways that we found in the real world. Okay, so are we in a new renaissance? I actually think we are. We've seen a lot of stuff, and on the left side there you see things going on right now. It has been going on for a while on these signs of a renaissance, but I would look at as a reconnecting to the planet we're on. The mind shift is happening, that we are not only talking about the environment as a sector anymore, it's really about the planet, the biosphere, the Earth system. It's not about saving the environment, it's about saving ourselves, basically. How can we continue with a good life on the planet? It's not just climate, it's global change. And it's not just linked, social and ecological, it's totally intertwined systems. What things are happening? Well, we heard about the nudge in the last talk. We have changes in incentive structures. Could that work out? So these are a couple of bullet points, I think, for that we'll be discussing the coming days quite a lot, actually, these type of issues. And in my mind, I think that the whole belief system is really important, that the world views, actually, that we really see the connection to what I started with, this privilege of being alive for a couple of decades on this earth. And then working with arts and experimentation there in lots of novel ways, music and arts, to not only think about with this part, but also connect it to the whole human being, actually, is another very important dimension. Okay, so just to finish up, this is basically the message I tried to convey today, that we are part of, an embedded part of the biosphere, totally dependent on it, but also shaping it now at the global scales. So it's really about, I think the really chances and opportunities we have as Homo sapiens is to figure out ways to really stimulate the emergence of social ecological innovations that reconnect ourselves to the planet that we're part of. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, you're probably thinking not another presentation, so I'm the last one, and then I think we'll have a discussion. I want to concentrate on this question about what is a transformation, so this sort of definitional question. I think if we're going to discuss transformations, we better have a sort of idea about what a transformation might be. So that's what I'm really dealing with today. I'm by background an innovation studies person, so what I'm really focusing on today is technological change, but how that interacts with economic and social and cultural change as well. So the first thing, of course, is that we need to have some terms. And there are a number of different words that are used in these kinds of debates in the different communities that are concerned with, broadly, I suppose, in some sense, what Karen also talked about, non-linear change. Change that in some sense involve a qualitative step over time from one kind of state to another. And in a discussion about that kind of change, there are a number of terms that are used, and often they're used in a sort of confusing way as well, not accurately. So I think my first appeal to you would be, as you begin, and many of you work in this area already, to work in this area, please be accurate about the terms that are used, and also not overclaim when you use a term like transformation or transition. Or threshold or tipping point. These are other very popular words, of course, terms, concepts, clouds of ideas that have begun to populate this area. So what I'll try to do is just to describe a few dimensions of such step changes that one needs to always be considering, and also some of the difficulties and ambiguities involved in that. It's not obvious for everyone always what is a transformation or what is a transition. So the first big question from innovation studies anyway, and this is an old debate in questions of technological change, is are you talking about incremental change or something which might be termed radical change? And the great economist of innovation, Chris Freeman, argued that it depends where you stand, where you are. So depending on who you are and what your perspective is, something might appear incremental or something might appear radical. So here are a couple of examples. These are paper machines. They're both called Foudrinier machines. They were invented, so our modern way of producing paper was invented by two brothers in France in the 1830s. On the left, you have a Foudrinier machine from 1850, and on the right, you have a Foudrinier, a very new one, in Sweden, a Stora Enso machine. Now, in fact, the fundamental process is the same. You produce pulp, and then you put it onto a web, and you dry it, and you spin it. But of course, the machine on the right is radically different from the thing on the left. Some people would see a huge continuity in this 160 years of development. We make paper today in exactly the same way, fundamentally, as we did 160 years ago. But there are so many very radical elements associated with the machine on the right, which can produce, I don't know, maybe 1,000 times as much paper in an hour as the machine on the left. And there are many technologies embedded in that which control it and so on, which are radically different. So depending on where you stand, something may seem an incremental development or a very radical change. These are both Fords, the Model T Ford and the new Ford Focus, 100 years apart. They're both quite similar. They both got 4 wheels, engines in the front. In fact, the engines are different. So this is a hybrid on the right. But of course, the machine on the right is radically different. The systems within which it operates, the transport systems, the information systems, the skills of the driver and so on are radically different to the thing on the left, even though they might seem rather similar, and one could plot a history of the development of the Model T Ford to the Ford Focus as one of being in incremental steps. Messaging. You have the standard fixed line phone on the left, and this is an iPhone 5, an object of beauty on the right. They both kind of do the same thing, but no one would argue that they are not radically different. And certainly the emergence of mobile telephony is often seen as a radical break in the way in which networks of communication are constructed, used, the kind of business models involved, certainly the technologies. It's impossible to take a photograph with the thing on the left, for instance. But nevertheless, they both involve people being able to communicate with each other fundamentally and by voice. And is that a radical difference or not? So I want to argue that many incremental changes over time accumulate into radical transformations, but sometimes things which might appear to be incremental from some perspectives are actually very, very radical anyway. So this question about what is incremental and radical depends on where you stand. The second question is, if I'm going on too long, you'll stop me, Karen. What changes? So there are various ways in which we can talk about the kinds of changes that occur, and often we're now concerned with changes in systems or structures or the relationships which constitute systems, whether they are natural systems or social or technological systems. So I wanted to assure you that I'm not a technological determinist, and the way in which innovation studies people think about technological change today is in terms of changes within connected webs of relationships, which involve technological artifacts on the one hand, but all sorts of other infrastructural but also normative issues. You see at the top left, we're concerned here with the car. This has to do with the car, change in the car. So when we're thinking about transformations, it's not simply the changes that are happening in the artifact itself, but in the entire system of meaning and use and exchange within which that artifact is embedded. And of course, achieving change in a complex network of relationships is slower, much more complicated, involving mismatches and realignments over time than if you're simply talking about the artifact. Radical change in these kinds of networks is rarer, is more difficult to achieve, takes longer. What else changes, of course, is often the performance of the system that you're interested in. I'll give two examples. Classic Moore's law, of course, these are radical changes in the performance of transistors, of microchips, over time, going back now 40 years. And another kind of question we might be concerned with is how quickly these changes happen. A transformation might be involved with the speed of change, whether a change is gradual or sharp or fast. I think these are features that we would need to take account of. Here's another example. This is another socio-technical system, even though most people wouldn't recognize it as such. The maize, the industrial production of corn, and yield improvements over long periods of time. And one would have to argue that over the 60 years or so between 1940 and 2000, there has been really a radical change in the yield from maize plants, from about, this is in the US, from about 2 tons per hectare to up to 9. But this change has happened over a 60-year period. And in fact, if you look at the average line, it's an incremental series of incremental changes which are happening over that kind of period. Another much more abrupt change, perhaps, is to do with the World Wide Web. Everyone sees usually the World Wide Web, the emergence of that, as a transformative or radical event in not just technology, but relationships, markets, the way markets are created and so on. One of the first search engines is Lycos in 1996, only, 17 years ago, and involving the explosion of internet traffic in all sorts of different new segments, the creation of new markets, new kinds of uses. And this is seen as being very radical and quick. Then another question you would have to address if you're talking about transformation is, how broad is the change? What is being affected in the system that you're interested in? How deep is that change? So here are two examples. On the left, you have the wind turbine. Of course, the emergence of large-scale wind, in some senses, is a radical change in energy power structures, electricity power structures, systems in Europe, in China, in the United States. But for some people, the insertion of a new technology itself is not a transformation. What is transformational is actually to do with the restructuring of the networks within which those technologies are embedded, whether we have a standard grid or whether we have these new smart microgrids. Really, the deep transformation of a whole system is actually what they would regard as a transformation. Another big question is to do with intentionality. Is the transformation intended by the actors involved in it, or is it an emergent property of the system that you see? Most socio-technical change, anyway, is to a large extent, I think, probably emergent. But of course, when we talk about sustainability transformations or transitions, we're very interested in the question of whether it's possible to be purposive about such a change, to intend such a change, to shape it, to manage it, to make it happen. Those are the kinds of changes that I think people are interested in. And here are two examples from, again, the history of technology. The emergence of steam power in the Industrial Revolution, really the motivating force of the Industrial Revolution. And on the right-hand side, an example of a purposive change, which was attempted after the Second World War in many developed countries, the introduction of nuclear power, involving large-scale state intervention and programs, investments in R&D, the development of firms that could produce these things and run them. And the question is whether, what happens when you try to do a purposive transformation. There are question marks about that too. Finally, I'm coming to the end here. You have different notions of how transformation might then take place. You have evolutionary ideas, which have to do with, I guess, more continuities, but as I've stated, over long periods of time, an evolutionary change can appear to be a transformation, a radical shift, a step change. You have theories to do with revolutionary change, which really emphasize discontinuities in the development of systems. And then you have much more cyclical notions of how transformations happen. The adaptive cycle is a good example of that. And these different kinds of narratives of how transformation might take place also, these different models also have different narratives associated with them. Transformation is to do with growth and development. Or you have Marx and Schumpeter, who talk about creative destruction. Marx is a fantastic analyst of transformation, and I think people have become in the current crisis, of course, become very interested again in his descriptions of how social transformation actually happens and what causes it. You have, in the adaptive cycle, notions of growth, conservation, and so on. And finally, I think it's very important, processes of transformation are processes both of disordering systems and the reordering of systems. It's the collapse, the weakening, and the destruction of old things, and the re-emergence of new orders. And those are messy, very traumatic processes for many of the actors involved. We often assume that transformation is a good thing. It's bright lights, singing birds, beautiful trees. But transformations, to be honest, are for many people involved with them very confusing and destructive events, and that's something we need to take account of. So as my final slide, I think if you're going to be talking about transformation, please be accurate, be aware of how you're using the term and what you do and what you don't mean. And I think if you're going to talk about transformation, try and take some of these features of that transformation in your description of it, to do with the scale of it, how it's happening, the nature, how quickly it's happening, the depth of it, and whether it's intended or not. And I think if we can do that, we might come to a really good and strong, also scientifically a valid discussion about transformation. Thank you very much.